Hello, hello. Welcome to Resistance Live. It's Thursday, the 29th of May, 2025, and we have had some crazy news in the last 24 hours or so. I was shocked by this ruling that we have to talk about today, frankly. I know a lot of other lawyers were as well. There was an absolute sense of surprise about this, and I'll be really honest, there's even some joking going on in the legal community about how many of us forgot that this court even existed. So I'm going to explain all of that to you all this morning. First things first, today for our visually challenged viewers, I'm wearing a gray sweater today. My hair is pulled back. I'm a pink-skinned, green-eyed, dirty, blonde-haired woman. I'm in front of my bookshelf and my yellow utility cart. And I'm coming to you, as always, from occupied Muncie, Lenape, and Mohican land. Okay, so last night we had an absolutely shocking ruling. There's no other way to put it. Just an absolutely shocking ruling out of the U.S. Court of International Trade. Now, if you're wondering what the U.S. Court of International Trade is, you're probably not alone. And one of the things that we don't talk about a lot in the law is that there are specialized courts inside the federal court system for specialized areas. For instance, there are patent and trademark courts. There are courts that deal with various forms of other federal law that do not generally fall within the scope of what we expect standard federal judges to be familiar with. And the U.S. Court of International Trade is one of those courts. They are explicitly charged with dealing with challenges that impact international trade law. And they are outside the scope of our standard numbered federal circuit courts of appeal. Okay, so the U.S. Court of International Trade actually has nationwide jurisdiction. That means that unlike, let's say, the District Court for the District of Columbia, which is the trial court for any federal claims under federal law that take place inside the District of Columbia, the U.S. Court of International Trade can hear cases that originate from anywhere inside the United States. And also, unlike many traditional trial courts, they have a 3-judge panel that hears the claims at the trial court level. That does not take place inside the United States unless you are part of a multi-district litigation thing that's super big. I only had one case in my entire 15-year career as a federal court trial lawyer that was in front of more than one judge at the trial court level. So the U.S. Court of International Trade is very, very different from what we normally expect when we talk about the federal court system, okay? This ruling last night, okay, so let me just tell you the substance of it. Essentially, they ruled that Trump's actions in issuing tariffs willy-nilly against various countries, including specific tariffs with regard to Canada and Mexico, but also basically his entire international tariff scheme is unconstitutional and illegal. And particularly what they ruled was that it exceeds the authority that he had invoked under a 1977 federal law that has literally never been invoked by any other president. And in so doing, they essentially stopped Trump's tariffs plan in its tracks. So everything that Trump has tried to do under the purview of this particular law, that, as I said, has never been invoked for this purpose before, which essentially says that there are like emergency standards by which tariffs have to be imposed, every single thing that he has done using that authority is unconstitutional and illegal and has to stop. Again, radical ruling. And I will tell you that within 5 minutes of this decision coming out, the futures markets, because the markets had already closed, skyrocketed. The Dow Jones future markets went up by 500 points because, even if Trump thinks he understands economic policy, we all know where that's headed. This ruling gave some stability to Wall Street because the tariffs have, as we've talked about so many times here, injected a tremendous instability into the global economy. So this in and of itself has done a huge benefit right now, at least to starting to stabilize the U.S. economy. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, will this stick? So now I have to explain to you another nuance of this particular federal court, which is that it goes to an appeals court outside the scope also of our usual numbered circuit courts of appeals. So, for instance, if you have a patent challenge or if you have a challenge in front of this particular court, the U.S. Court of International Trade, it doesn't go to like the 11th Circuit or the 6th Circuit or the 2nd Circuit the way certain localized district federal courts go. So, for instance, Southern District of New York, that is a single district court located in Manhattan. If you lose in that court and you want to appeal, you appeal to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Not so for the U.S. Court of International Trade. The U.S. Court of International Trade, along with the patent courts and some others, go to what's called the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. Okay. And again, the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals is a court that has jurisdiction over the entire United States for these specific areas. Okay. Again, in my entire 15-year career as a federal court litigator, I had one case in front of the Federal Circuit. That's how infrequently we talk about these kind of cases. Now, if you're a patent lawyer, it might be a lot more, but this is not a court that gets like, generalized huge publicity. So the next step here is that the Trump administration, of course, could appeal this to the Federal Circuit, okay? And probably will. In fact, I would expect that we'll probably see a notice of appeal on this fairly quickly. I will tell you that having looked at the opinion that was issued by the U.S. Court of International Trade and the basis for their decision, this is a very uphill battle, okay? Very uphill battle. And we'll have to see how this goes. Never say never. I always say to you all, litigation is unpredictable. You never know how judges are going to rule, okay? But this is a very solid opinion out of the U.S. Court of International Trade. And for now, all the tariffs are stopped. Wild. Very significant overnight development that nobody would have predicted. So where it goes after the U.S. Federal Circuit, let's just say the U.S. Federal Circuit upholds the lower court, the U.S. Court of International Trade's decision. Then the Federal Circuit allows a writ of certiorari, same as all the other circuit courts of appeals, to the Supreme Court. Okay. And that means that, of course, you have to apply to the Supreme Court through the writ of certiorari to have them hear your case, which they can accept or they can deny. All right. So that's the roadmap for appeals here. And before anybody gets all cynical and bitter about what's going to happen in front of the Supreme Court, I have to say one thing about this, because there was a lot of analysis last night on Blue Sky when this particular opinion dropped from the legal community that I was obviously contributing to. And I happen to agree with this position, which is that what we have seen in the Supreme Court has been, and this comes from Alejandro Calabrera, who is a regular commentator, also a lawyer, a regular commentator on Supreme Court and the law, and particularly usually on trans issues and LGBTQ issues. But here the analysis is dead on. Okay. The one thing that we have seen out of the Supreme Court is they are taking steps to stop Trump from adversely impacting the U.S. economy. So, for instance, you will all remember we talked about that opinion last week that said that he could fire, for instance, my friend Kathy Harris from her role as the chairperson of the Merit Systems Protection Board, that he could fire the commissioner of the FCC. But in that ruling, and there was a lot of brouhaha about this in the legal community at the time, we talked about it here on the broadcast, they said, not so for Jerome Powell. You cannot fire the chairman of the Fed willy-nilly. And, we sort of talked about how they had invented this whole thing out of thin air, that there was no precedent for this, right? But nonetheless, they said, don't even think about firing the chairman of the Fed. He's going to serve out his term. Okay, that was essentially the message that came from the opinion. And so Alejandro's analysis of this, which I agree with entirely, is that this is only one example, and there are many, of the Supreme Court pushing back to protect the U.S. economy. And I will tell you, I think our chances are pretty good that if and when this tariff ruling makes it to the Supreme Court, and if they accept a review, I think the chances are at least, I would game it at 75-25, because, we're always going to lose Alito and Thomas. We know that, right? That this lower court decision is going to be upheld, because they know that crashing the U.S. economy is not in the benefit of anybody, especially not them, by the way. So this is a really interesting moment. And I have to say, again, very, 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 very curious, right? And for those who are asking, how is this going to play out, right? What are the logistics of this? Well, I have no idea. I can't answer that question. I mean, I will tell you, though, that right now, the idea that, there are incoming tariffs being charged on foreign companies who are trying to sell goods into the United States, that process has ground to a halt. And how that's going to play out for the American consumer is actually likely to be quite good. So, again, the logistics of this are curious. I'm not actually sure how that works, but I will tell you that there is no legal ability right now of the U.S. federal government to charge tariffs on incoming goods from anywhere. under this particular law that Trump invoked. They may have other means of doing it. Don't get me wrong, because I will remind you that, like tariffs on like sanctioned stuff are regular. And we have had tariffs sort of historically for other reasons. It's this particular, like, I'm invoking this law so I can impose tariffs on anybody that I feel like, that is currently not at all possible. So really, really curious to see how this goes. I mean, I have to say, I think it's great. And, the fact that we have had the courts, again, I've been telling you guys this, but the courts have actually stepped up in many ways that I, frankly, in my own worldview, when he came into office on January 20th, they have stepped up in ways that even I thought they might not. So I will take this win. Like, I will take this as a huge win right now. And I think it's really good. And I think we all should take it. Now, I had some questions on the Patreon feed this morning. Reminder, you want to ask me questions, you can head on over there and become a paid subscriber for as little as $5 a month, about whether or not this whole thing of tariffs on, tariffs off is stock market manipulation. And I think that's a really good question. You all know I used to be a securities fraud lawyer on Wall Street. That was my job, in addition to like human rights work at pro bono. And pump and dump schemes have been around since the beginning of time, essentially, right? At the beginning of markets, at least, where, you jack up the price of a stock. Somebody's got inside information that's going to make that stock price drop. Sometimes people bet in favor of the drop when they have that inside information, and they make money off of all of it, right? Or they sell at the peak and they know that the drop is coming. Okay. That's illegal, by the way, under the securities laws of the United States. The question of whether or not he's intentionally manipulating the stock market, it's possible, but I will also just tell you that I think part of what's happening here is that we have a president with malignant narcissism and dementia who decides randomly that he's pissed off and he feels like we're being cheated because, reminder, he has a persecution complex that now is playing out in relation to the entire nation, right? He decides willy-nilly that he's going to, he's been doing crazy stuff like claiming he's going to assert tariffs against Pfizer as a drug company, which you can't do, right? I think a lot of this is him simply acting on impulse, with his impulses being deeply demented and sick. And that has caused all these ups and downs in the stock market and in the global economy. I think that is a much more likely explanation. But do I put it past them that there might be folks pulling strings behind the scenes, like Stephen Miller, who we're going to talk about in a minute, for purposes of, manipulating the U.S. economy? That's entirely possible too. It could be both. It could be both. All right. And so, the thing I just have to remind you all, though, is that the SEC is under the control of the executive branch. That's the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is charged for enforcing the law against those who violate the federal securities laws. And the people who prosecute violations of those laws are DOJ securities lawyers. So the idea that anybody's going to be prosecuted for any of this market manipulation anytime soon, if that's what in fact it is, are like zero. Now, there is a civil court mechanism that can be applied to companies, and I'm sure there are lawyers who are kind of thinking about this in various ways, through the form of shareholders' derivative actions. And that is something that I used to litigate myself, where shareholders come forward in a class action format and say, we know that they knew, for instance, this drug company knew that the testing results for their drug showed that the drug would kill people, and they delayed the release of those results so that they could pump up their stock price. Very classic story, right? Those shareholders then can assert claims, civil claims, for very high damages against companies that do that sort of thing. Now, does it work the same against the federal government? No. Might it work the same against Trump if he was acting outside the scope of his presidential authority? Maybe. But I'm not sure that even is going to fly under the recent Supreme Court authority, given that says he's got immunity from various things, not necessarily from civil suits, but from criminal prosecution for his actions taken within the scope of the presidency. So anybody's guess, right? What could happen with this in civil court? Okay. So in any event, like I said, we should take the win. And pretty much every lawyer I know was shocked by this decision, and also quite pleased. Okay, so let's take it for what it is. The tariff scheme is gone for now. And that's very good for all of us, right? Particularly good if you have like retirement accounts you rely on in the markets. Okay, we have to talk about, I was hesitant to talk about this, but I think I'm going to talk about it anyway. There is a very gossip-driven scandal unfolding in Washington, D.C. that has gripped Blue Sky by the throat since late last night. And essentially, the facts are this, and then we can talk a little bit about the speculation. Okay, so when Elon Musk came to Washington, D.C., Stephen Miller was kind of charged with managing him. And we know that there have been some conflicts in all of that. Long story short, eventually it was Katie Miller, Stephen Miller's wife, who was assigned to kind of be Elon Musk's handler. And for several months now, apparently, the insider scoop inside the Beltway has been very, very curious about the nature of the relationships in various directions between Elon Musk, Katie Miller, and Stephen Miller, to the point that Wired has an article that seems to imply, if you're reading between the lines, that there might have been some kind of like throupledom going on here, meaning that like Elon and Katie, Katie and Stephen, who knows, that there may have potentially been some dynamic there. And there are off-the-record Republican lawmakers that are like, we don't want to know what's really going on there, but it's very clear that there is like intimate relationships of some kind, whether or not those are sexual is anybody's guess, going on between the three of them in ways where like the Millers have seemed kind of like about as tight with Elon as you can get. Okay. Now, the reason why this has all come to light in the last, let's call it 18 hours, is because Elon made this huge announcement yesterday that he was leaving the Trump administration, and he bashed Trump's trade policy in so doing. I have very serious questions about whether or not we should consider the interviews that he's giving right now reliable, because I will tell you that he still wields an enormous amount of influence over Trump. And even if there's a little bit of souring going on there, as often happens with Trump, and even if Trump eventually throws him under the bus, he has Trump's ear. And informal advisory positions inside the Trump administration are kind of common, right? Like he talks to people, somebody puts an idea in his head and he runs with it, all right? So the idea that Elon's totally gone from government is something that I don't think we should take at face value. But Katie Miller has now apparently left the Trump administration to go and work with Elon Musk. And the rumor now, again, I was really hesitant to talk about this. I got to put the whole kind of like, speculation banner over this. And it's not my speculation. This is like a lot of discussion about what's happening inside the Beltway and, what people seem to believe to be true. Okay. Again, what seems to be the case is that Katie Miller may have left Stephen Miller now for Elon Musk. They have 3 children together. I have to tell you, I'm going to remind you all because, people were making like jokes about Katie Miller having terrible taste in men. I have to remind you all something about Katie Miller that like should not be forgotten. All right. Which is that she was the press secretary for Pence during the first Trump administration. Okay. And at some point during the family separation policy, Pence's team were struggling with why Katie Miller, who at that point was going by her maiden name because they weren't married yet, didn't seem to have any empathy for the fact that Trump was like tearing toddlers away from their parents and putting them in separate detention facilities. And the Pence team sent Katie Miller to Texas to go through one of these detention facilities because they thought it might give her some emotional sense of why what Trump was doing was wrong. And when she came out, she was unmoved. Beyond that, kind of like, actually sort of made me think maybe it's a good idea. So lest we have any sympathy for Katie Miller, right? Or any kind of like, to be fair, nobody would want to sleep with Stephen Miller, which is a comment I saw last night. I want to remind you that she's a sociopath also. She doesn't deserve any of our kind of like positive thoughts in this scenario. Okay. Now, did I have my own moment of like very deep schadenfreude that like Stephen Miller may have lost his wife to an immigrant and, let alone there may be some weird throupledom going on there when we hear all sorts of slurs about that on X. Yes, I definitely had my own moment about it where I was like, this is nauseating and simultaneously delicious. Like you kind of look at this scandal and you kind of can't take your eyes off it. And nonetheless, this is all very, very messy. And Stephen Miller, who I personally will just tell you, I think is kind of acting as the de facto president right now. He has been referred to pejoratively as the prime minister of the United States right now. He was very angry at Elon Musk last night on X, subtweeting him about Musk's comments about the trade policy, acting out. You could practically hear the tone of his, nasally little voice in the way that you read the post that he was posting to Elon. It was animated and not happy. So, I will just say that I share curiosity about whether or not this could be something that might eventually take down Stephen Miller, and I would not be sorry to see him go in any way, shape, or form from the standpoint of any role of power anywhere. He's like number one on my list of the people I want to see set to trial after this whole thing is over. So again, take it all for what it's worth. Some of it's gossip, but she's definitely leaving. And the other thing is that she changed her banner on X. Can't make this shit up. She changed her banner on X to a photograph of one of the SpaceX rockets taking off, which is very phallic in its representation. You can go find it if you would care to. So, I'm going to take my entertainment where I can find it. All right. And I will freely admit that I'm taking a little bit of entertainment on this today with the understanding that there's some speculation attached to what's actually going on. But she's gone, which also, by the way, isn't necessarily a bad thing. So this is, a fascinating development, and I'm just going to leave it there. Okay. We have to talk about the new nickname that Trump has been given on Wall Street, which is President Taco. That stands for Trump always chickens out. And the reason why this has come up on Wall Street is because he's been caving on tariffs nonstop, right? This was before the tariff ruling that we had last night. He was being referred to as President Taco, okay? And that was because, as we've talked about here, is it a tariff day or is it not a tariff day? Do we have tariffs against Mexico today or not? Do we have tariffs against China, and are they 50% or 10%, right? Every day it's a different story because Trump gets a phone call and somebody says, we're actually really doing the kind of thing that you want. Remember that whole story where Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, said to him, we already have troops at the border and we're happy to send more. That was enough for him to say, okay, we're going to lower the tariffs on Mexico. So this rumor that this nickname has been applied to him was actually brought to Trump in a press conference yesterday. Somebody asked me a question about this on the Patreon feed. Is like, when's he going to melt down about this? Oh, he already has. So yesterday, someone asked him at one of these press sprays that he does that are randomly available now, apparently inside the Oval Office at any hour of the day or night, how he felt about this. And he lost his mind. Not that there's much of it left to lose, but he lost his mind. And, you can all go kind of read about it if you would care to. But, he said, I don't know why anybody would say that. Most people actually perceive that I'm a really tough guy, blah, 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 blah. And so one of the things that I want people to be aware of also, because people have been asking me about narcissistic collapse, is that this is something that for him, if it takes hold, and already has honestly caused a narcissistic injury, is something that is actually going to make him melt down faster. Okay. And that doesn't mean that I think, posting President Taco on Blue Sky or Threads or wherever is considered activism, because it's not. But we also know that humor directed toward autocrats actually, and shaming and humiliation is actually something that can start to undercut their authority generally. So, it's Taco Thursday, I guess, is the way to put it, right? All right. Have to talk about a couple other quick things here. Earlier this week or late last week, Trump denied additional FEMA benefits to North Carolina. These were benefits, by the way, that were promised when Biden was on his way out of office to help remove debris that had built up from all those terrible floods in Western North Carolina after Helene. Just flat out refused, said, you don't need it. And we know that he is using FEMA funds right now as a wedge issue. Yes, there are people in the line of fire with regard to the looming hurricane season who are very, very worried about this now, and rightfully should be. I do want to remind you all that one of the things that has the potential to mobilize things in North Carolina is things like this, because it really brings home to people that his policies are going to hit him where it hurts. So it's really messed up. I think we're going to see a lot more of it, frankly, because we know he denied PPE and ventilators and all sorts of other things to blue states during the COVID pandemic because he thought people didn't vote for him there, right? We know that he sent masks to Putin instead of to blue states in the middle of the pandemic, right? People forget these things, but let's not memory hole it. So none of this is new. And again, for those of you who are mobilizing in North Carolina, because we have a bunch of you on the feed here, remember that, like this issue is something that can really wake people up. Okay, a couple of things on the immigration front that we have to talk about. The Russian scientist who was detained at Logan Airport for bringing in inactive frog embryo cells on behalf of her colleague, researcher at Harvard, who was picked up, immediately had her visa canceled by an immigration officer. That's illegal. And was sent to a detention center, has now been ordered by the District Court for the District of Vermont to be released. I'm going to remind you all, the District Court for the District of Vermont is the same court that has now released 3 unlawful detainees, including Madawi, right? We talked about this a few weeks ago when he was released, and he managed to be released in time to actually walk across the Columbia stage and get his diploma. This is good news. And again, the courts continue to push back on this. The more people are released, and she's now has criminal charges against her also, even though she didn't commit a crime. The more people who are released, the more there is additional public knowledge of all the unfair ways in which immigration policy is being levied. Speaking of which, there is a very interesting piece in the New York Times from yesterday about a town in Iowa where a woman who worked at a diner, she'd been there for 40 years, 3 kids, right? Had applied for legal status, previously had been she freely admits this, for 4 years in the aughts, very early in the 2000s, had been in a marriage that was designed to look like a true marriage so that she could pursue citizenship. And then she got divorced, and INS knew this, right? ICE knew this. She admitted it, she apologized. This was not something where there was a looming imminent prosecution. And she is beloved in this town. Beloved. 80% of the town voted for Trump. And they picked her up and detained her. And she is still in jail. And this has caused upheaval, not surprisingly, in this town, where quite a number of people who voted for Trump are now wait, we thought they were only going to pick up people in gangs. Again, I have to remind you all, propaganda, right-wing news mechanisms, right? A lot of people got conned by this, okay? We are hearing more and more stories like this where people in deep red areas are hold up. This is actually amoral. We don't agree with it. The policies are too extreme. We had similar things, by the way, similar evidence last night at a town hall. There's been several of these actually in the last week where deep red districts with Republican representatives, those representatives at town halls are being booed, screamed at about immigration, about the budget bill. The footage is wild. And so the thing I want to remind everybody of is that our own organizing work, even if you happen to be a blue dot in a red state, has a lot of room to grow right now in this regard, because people are starting to really object. The potential loss of Medicaid, the way immigration policies are targeting, members of society. I have all sorts of theories about how borders shouldn't even exist, but nonetheless, targeting members of society who literally have been embedded, active members of communities for decades, right? Raising children here, raising families here. This woman who was arrested at this town in Iowa missed her kid's middle school graduation. That child was born here 14 years ago, right? She's a lovely woman. You should go read the article. I mean, this kind of stuff is changing minds. And I don't want people to neglect it, and I will just say that for all the people who are screw these people, they voted for Trump. We're going to need everybody that we can get to get out of this. And, frankly, I think the fact that people are starting to become aware that they were lied to and that the enactment rather of these policies has direct, deeply harmful effects to people that they care about may potentially be an opportunity to really turn the tide. So I want people to be really aware of all of that as it's going on. Okay. The budget bill is still on the Hill. I'm going to remind you all to please keep calling the Senate. There are several provisions that absolutely have to be removed. The one that denies medical care to trans people will kill people. Will kill people. There's a fantastic article that I pinned, by the way, on my Blue Sky this morning about the fact that essentially this policy says to trans people who are on Medicaid, you either have to detransition or die. That is essentially the line that is being drawn by this budget. And all of us, regardless of our gender identity, really need to stand up for trans folks on this. Please include it in your calls. We also still have that provision in the budget bill that would deny federal courts the ability to enforce contempt against parties that violate injunctions. This is purely designed to let Trump run willy-nilly over the law. That provision also absolutely has to come out. There is still a provision in there that allows average everyday citizens to buy gun silencers, must be gone. And that's on top of the fact that we have all sorts of reasons to object on the basis of the bill itself. You know, like 12 million people, 13 million people being kicked off Medicaid or losing partial benefits. The cuts to Social Security, the cuts to food stamps. Again, these are things that you must call about, like no exceptions, all right? So lots of work to be done by all of us. I'm going to remind you all that we still have available our downloadable guide on how to lead change where you live and how to do it particularly without burning out. It's already linked in the show notes, and I will link it again in the comments. And as always, I want to thank all our subscribers here, particularly our Patreon subscribers, for allowing me to continue doing this work. You know, I'm out here on my own. I do not have an enormous network of white men behind me pushing me forward. Yes, I'm being a bit pejorative, but I'm bothered by how many kind of like white men get so much viewership on YouTube about this stuff, and the rest of us are kind of left out here floundering a lot of the time. And so I greatly appreciate your subscriptions. Please, if this work is meaningful to you, consider going over to patreon.com/resistancelive and becoming a paid subscriber. And also thank you to our YouTube subscribers, because you guys rock. You want a live chat, you can join there. And of course, drop us a comment if you're watching on the replay. Let the algorithm know that you like us, thumbs up us, subscribe. And I will be back here tomorrow, regular time. There will also be a progressive coffee hour for our Patreon subscribers tomorrow afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 noon Pacific. And I will catch you all then. All right. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday, my friends. I'll see you soon. Bye.